You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for April 30th, 2021. This week, COVID, AFib screening, a medically conservative take on conduction system pacing, tobacco, and a truly heartfelt essay. First up is COVID. Now the main thing to say is that the vaccine works. In the US, in Israel, we see that as the numbers of vaccinated adults go up, cases go down, just as the trial results would predict. But that's not the best part. New England Journal had a brief report on breakthrough infections after vaccinations in 2 patients. That's right, 2 of 417 employees of a university in New York City. Neither of these patients had severe disease. And I think this is the prevailing message. Vaccination massively, almost completely reduces the chance of severe COVID illness. But sadly, the global situation remains dire in South America and India. Now, one thought I had as a total non-expert in public health or economics or policy is this. What if we took the vaccines that we're giving now to super low-risk young people and sent them overseas to countries that were in far more need? I say this because isn't there a debate about the benefit-harm calculus of rushing to vaccinate healthy young people against SARS-CoV-2? Couldn't one make a utilitarian or effective altruist case to surge vaccines to places like India and South America that need them far more? Now I'll leave it at that. I don't want to jump too far out of my lane. First cardiology topic today is AFib screening. At the European Heart Rhythm meeting this month, Professor Emma Svenberg presented clinical outcomes from the Stroke Stop study of AFib screening in 2 counties in Sweden. This is such a nifty and important trial, and kudos to Dr. Svenberg and colleagues for bringing outcome evidence to the issue of AFib screening. Stroke Stop is a pragmatic trial of offering AF screening to 75 to 76-year-old residents of 2 regions in Sweden. Screening for AF was done with a handheld device twice daily for 2 weeks. 14,000 patients were invited to screening. This was the active arm. 14,000 patients were not invited. These were the control arm. The combined primary endpoint was stroke, embolism, death, and severe bleeding over 5 years. Stroke Stop investigators have already published in 2015 in Circulation an interim report showing that new AFib was found in 3% of the screened population, whereas only 0.5% were found on the first ECG. There's no surprise there. The more you look, the more AFib you find. The interim report also found that more than 90% of patients with newly diagnosed AFib accepted initiation of oral anticoagulants. This too has been shown in other studies. Svenberg presented the much-awaited clinical outcomes from the 5-year study in a late-breaking session. Steve Stiles from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology has excellent news coverage, which is important because the paper is not yet published. In the 2 groups of about 14,000 patients each, the mean age, 76, CHADS VASC of about 3.5, and 10% with prior stroke or TIA. A key feature of Stroke Stop was that the group randomized to screening were those offered screening. The control arm were those not offered screening. And these 2 groups constitute the main or intention to treat analysis. But only half of the active arm actually had the screening. The other half, about 7,000 patients, had declined screening or could not do screening due to, say, dementia or other comorbid conditions. Now, the group of 7,000 patients, half of those offered screening constituted the as-treated arm of screening. Now the main result. The main result was that 4,456 events occurred in the randomized to screening active arm versus 4,616 events in the not offered screening arm. The absolute difference was 160 events. The hazard ratio calculated at 0.96, 4% reduction. Lower bound 0.92 and upper bound of, get this, 0.999. And a p-value of 0.045. My friends, it doesn't get much closer to that significance threshold than that. Svenberg also presented the as-treated analysis. This was the 7,000 patient subset of the 14,000 patients who were offered screening and accepted screening. The hazard ratio for the primary endpoint of these patients was much better at 0.76, but of course, this isn't exactly an ideal comparison, which Svenberg pointed out, because these patients who were offered screening and accepted screening were healthier than the subset of patients who were offered screening and did not accept screening. For instance, they had lower CHA2DS2-VASc, fewer prior strokes, less hypertension, less vascular disease, and less diabetes. So the Stroke Stop authors concluded that population-based screening for AFib provided a net clinical benefit in an elderly population, and efforts should be made to increase participation. Okay, we're going to have to wait for the paper, but here are 4 comments. First, cost efficacy. In their rationale and design paper published in Europace, the Stroke Stop authors write, quote, "Our hypothesis is that screening for AFib will reduce stroke incidence in the screened population, and that this screening will prove to be cost effective." The cost efficacy point is crucial because even if you accept the statistically significant result as clinically important, you have to show that this is cost effective. Now, oodles of prior studies of AFib show that screening picks up AFib, and this leads to more office visits, and that leads to more prescriptions, and this is a lot of downstream stuff that happens, all of which cost money. So does the number needed to screen to prevent one stroke come at an acceptable cost? Now, I have no doubt that a cost analysis is forthcoming. Second comment, was it the AFib detection or just enhanced care in the screened group that improved the primary endpoint? I think one of the most interesting slides from this study, one that showed that before screening, about 12% of the active arm had AFib. After screening, this went up to 14%, 2% difference. So my question is, how exactly does picking up just a 2% increase in AFib episodes, many of which were brief, how does that lead to a reduction in serious outcomes? Now, one argument is that you use more oral anticoagulants, and this helps reduce stroke, and that helps reduce the primary endpoint. But the other possibility is performance bias. Patients who had AFib detected and who accepted screening had more clinical encounters. This could mean better blood pressure control, better attention to diuretics or medication adherence, and the like. By the way, this was the same issue in the East AF NET 4 trial that found early rhythm control was better than rate control. Early rhythm control had way more clinical care. Now, performance bias is not a knock on the investigators. It is just a part of pragmatic strategy trials like this. When the paper comes out, we'll have to assess for the differences in care delivered. All right, third comment. This was a small effect size that barely reached statistical significance. That doesn't mean it's not a true effect, but let's look at the strength of the evidence. The p-value is about 2 standard deviations from the null. An online calculator gives it a z-score of 1.97. If you go to another online calculator, you can convert that p-value to a Bayes factor, which is simply a likelihood ratio of the probability of getting this data if there was no difference in the 2 arms, divided by the probability of the data, given a true effect of being offered screening. The likelihood ratio or Bayes factor of stroke stop calculates to 0.14. That is considered weak to moderate evidence. You want your likelihood ratio or Bayes factor to be super low. That's so that even if you had a pessimistic prior belief, the strength of the evidence would sway your beliefs after the trial. For context, the Pfizer and Moderna COVID-19 vaccine trials had a likelihood ratio or Bayes factor that was 0.000 with 30 zeros. Recall that trials are just like medical tests. Rather than give you a definitive answer, they update your prior beliefs or knowledge. Now, what should our prior belief about screening be? Well, if you go to a paper by Saqib et al. In the International Journal of Epidemiology in 2015, and I will link to it, it is a systematic review of screening trials and meta-analysis, and it found that most screening for serious disease, like cancer, which is far more deadly than AFib, rarely finds overall mortality benefits. So let's be generous and say that our prior for AFib screening reducing heart outcomes would be an 80-20 odds of no effect. Well, 80-20 odds is 4. Now, by Bayes' theorem, which states that the prior times the likelihood ratio, or Bayes factor, updates your belief after the evidence, you get 4 times 0.14, or 0.56. So that means if you were held an 80-20 pessimistic prior, the probability of these data from stroke stop, given the null hypothesis, is 56%. Okay, let's say you're a Martian and you don't know that most screening trials rarely find reduction in heart outcomes, like death. So you have a neutral prior, a belief of 50-50 odds of reducing a hard endpoint. Well, 1 times 0.14 yields a 14% probability of this data given the null hypothesis. Of course, the other thing you can do with Bayes is determine the probability of a 10% or 20% risk reduction. I won't do that because my editor might get chest pain. She's probably already having some discomfort. But you can eyeball the 95% confidence interval, which yielded a lower bound of the hazard ratio of 0.92, and figure out that the chance of a 20% risk reduction is near zero. Okay, fourth comment on this important study. Proponents of AFib screening might say that technology will soon render AF detection akin to a vital sign, like a blood pressure. For instance, older patients who have pacemakers are essentially AFib screened all the time, and the advent of smart watches and devices will soon reduce the burden of AFib screening. That means a lot of this wrangling over offering population screening will gradually become a moot point because many, if not most patients, will be able to do it without doctors. The next step, therefore, is not so much whether we can detect AFib, but whether treating it reduces outcome. It's a huge question, one for the next generation of clinicians, and there are ongoing trials. Now, I can't help but wonder this. Tell me if you think I'm right or wrong. I can't help but wonder whether we could accomplish the same small effect size seen in stroke stop by simply choosing a random sample of 75 to 76-year-old patients with a CHA2DS2-VASc of 3 to 4 and testing oral anticoagulation versus nothing regardless of AFib episodes. All right, next topic is conduction system pacing. The first thing, what's up with the cardiology in Copenhagen? It seems nearly every week I'm discussing some important science from this city, so kudos to all the researchers in Copenhagen. Dr. Michael Vintner presented results of the HIS alternative trial at the European Heart Rhythm Association meeting. JACC Electrophysiology has a simultaneous publication. The study question involves use of HIS bundle pacing, conduction system pacing, to achieve effective cardiac resynchronization therapy in patients eligible for CRT. Let's do a brief intro on CRT. First, left bundle branch block can worsen heart failure in patients with systolic dysfunction because the RV contracts before the LV and the dyssynchrony exacerbates the already low cardiac output. And numerous trials have shown that patients with systolic dysfunction and left bundle branch block have improved outcomes with biventricular pacing. The RV and LV leads eliminate the left bundle branch block by pacing the heart at the same time. CRT with BiV devices is basically electrical therapy for the left bundle branch block. Recently, many EP docs, including me, have become interested in using conduction system pacing to accomplish simultaneous activation of the RV and LV in patients with left bundle branch block and heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. One of the aesthetically intoxicating aspects of pacing the His bundle or left bundle is that conduction occurs with a narrow QRS because it's going down the conduction system, and this indicates simultaneous activation of both ventricles. I was part of the HIS-SYNC randomized controlled trial, which showed that His bundle pacing was not statistically superior to BiV pacing for improving EF, but there was surely a signal towards an improved benefit in EF. Now, one key lesson we learned from HIS-SYNC trial and other studies is that conduction system pacing can only correct true left bundle branch block. A lead in the conduction system cannot correct an electrical delay of the LV when the problem is in the ventricular muscle. So the HIS alternate trial randomized one group of CRT eligible patients to get His bundle pacing and the other standard CRT. The primary endpoint was a success rate of obtaining capture of the His bundle with narrowing of the QRS duration. The secondary outcome was a fall in end systolic volume. The key inclusion criteria was a true left bundle branch block by the Strauss criteria, or greater than 90% RV pacing, which of course activates the RV first, as in a typical left bundle branch block. So His pacing was achieved in 72% of the patients in the His CRT group. As it was in HIS-SYNC, this study had a lot of crossovers. 28% crossed over from the His bundle pacing to the CRT group. At 6 months, QRS duration were similar in both groups, and in the intention to treat analysis 6-month follow-up, LVEF increased by 16% in the His group, 13% in the BiV group, not significantly different. Pacing thresholds, however, were higher for the His CRT compared to BiV CRT, both at implantation and at 6-month follow-up. And the per protocol LVEF, that was where the patients where His was successfully achieved, was significantly higher at 6 months, and the end systolic volume was lower in the His bundle treated patients compared to BiV CRT. Okay, comments. As a conduction system pacing enthusiast, I worry here about sounding too much like the content experts I criticize for being too rosy about their data. So let's be perfectly clear. This was a very small trial with a surrogate short-term endpoint. What's more, the higher threshold to correct a left bundle branch block with His bundle pacing is a really important challenge and headwind over the long term because it means more generator changes for these patients, and that is not a positive. So, CRT with BiV pacing has been proven beneficial in multiple trials, and data like this should not change our baseline practice. But this study shows that it is feasible to correct a left bundle branch block with His bundle pacing, and it shows that if you do, EF and QRS improves similarly. But of course, these are still surrogate outcomes, not clinical outcomes. Progress in medicine is usually iterative. These 95% COVID vaccines are not the rule of thumb. But my take from doing His bundle pacing for 5 years is that it is hard. The tools are still primitive. For His bundle pacing, there is essentially one lead and 2 sheaths. For BiV pacing, there are numerous leads, dozens of sheaths and wires and inner sheaths and snares that have all been developed to better implant BiV devices. His bundle pacing now is where BiV pacing was 10 plus years ago. 2 more comments. His bundle pacing can be a great fallback when there are no coronary sinus branches available for CRT. But you can't just do His bundle pacing without practice, it's too hard. My suggestion, therefore, is that operators learn to do His bundle pacing on easier cases of, say, sinus node dysfunction or heart block. You hone your skills so that you have it in your bag of tricks for these tough BiV cases. The new technique on the block, though, is left bundle branch pacing. Here you use the same lead, the same sheath, but you burrow the lead through the septum so as to capture the left bundle. This results in a right bundle branch block, and remember, in right bundle branch block, the LV activation is not late. Left bundle branch pacing is feasible, I have done it, and the thresholds are far better. It too is intoxicating in its aesthetics. Of course, we need to study CRT with left bundle branch pacing instead of His bundle pacing, but alas, the industry has no confluence of interest here because if conduction system pacing works, it means implanting fewer expensive CRT devices. Next topic, the FDA. The US FDA has announced that within a year, it will ban menthol in cigarettes as well as flavors including menthol in cigars. Menthol makes it easier to start smoking and also enhances the effects of nicotine, making it more addictive and harder to quit, said the FDA in a statement. Now, flavored, mass-produced cigars and cigarillos are disproportionately popular among youth, especially non-Hispanic Black high school students, who in 2020 reported past 30-day cigar smoking at levels twice as high as their white counterparts. Now, my comment on this FDA move is good. Anything that reduces smoking rates, especially in the young, is a huge plus for public health. Of course, I've read online that some people worry that this new mandate will create a black market for this product, and that could be problematic. And my comment about that worry is yes, please, it is always important to think about trade-offs. Remember the wisdom of Thomas Sowell, who said, "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." That said, however, smoking is just so hazardous that to protect public safety, government should act. A world in which it is harder for people to get addicted to smoking, I think, is a better one. Okay, final topic, a heartfelt essay. My colleague, Melissa Walton-Shirley, has penned one of the best essays I've ever read on the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology. You should go to a quiet place, turn off your notifications, and slowly read Losing Both Parents During COVID, A Physician's Unwitnessed Grief. Melissa Walton-Shirley is a force of nature. In the last few years of our gatherings at medical meetings, we knew her parents were struggling with health issues, and her essay poignantly tells a story of how this terrible pandemic has robbed families and patients of having a good death. Quote, "In early May, I would get the closest to my father that I would ever be again, 6 feet away as he sat on a swing on their front porch. It was there that he told me what I already knew. He was dying. There was no hug to follow." Look, I'm not the most religious person in the world, but the goodness of Melissa Walton-Shirley surely increases the likelihood ratio of there being a benevolent force in this universe. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. And remember, friends, please, if you like this podcast, please take the time to give us a rating, write us a review, as that helps others find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.